Hey everyone, my name's Kyle Schlosser. Today we're going to be learning how to create this effect we see here with the wacky wavy inflatable tube man on the edge of an airplane. We're going to be using the Vellum solver to simulate the character waving around. We're going to use the Vellum solver to create that duct tape. We're going to do some modeling, and we're going to use constraints to simulate the pump getting blown around in the wind. So without any further ado, let's get into it. Here we are in my Houdini scene where I built this effect. I'm just going to go through node by node and show you how it was done. So let's start with the pump geometry. We're going to build that out. Okay, so to build the pump, first I started with a simple box. Gave it some UVs, brought in a tube, positioned it over the box, intersecting a little bit, more UVs, and Boolean those two together to create this pretty basic shape. Delete the top, extrude it to give it a little bit of thickness, bevel the edges just to round those out, make it look nicer. And that's the basic pump shape right there. Now I wanted a grate type look in the front, so I created another cube, another box, gave it some subdivisions, subdivided it down to create this rounded rectangle look, positioned it into place in front of the other shape, and then another Boolean. There we go. Cut it out. Now with this hole here, we want to bring in the actual grate. So created a grid, put it into place. Now I used an add node to delete geometry, but keep the points. So we're just left with these perfectly uniform points. And now I just simply use to connect adjacent pieces to create this grid pattern. This is just about dialing in these numbers until we get what we want. And we have some stragglers on the edges here that I don't want. I just want this grid pattern. But these are outside of the bounds of what we're going to use, so it doesn't matter. Then I drop the polywire to give them some thickness to create that grid pattern. And once again, a Boolean to fuse the two together. Give it a second to think, and there we go. Pretty cool. Very simple. And that's the pump. You also notice up here, I copied these two nodes over without the Boolean, just for this bottom part. So we're going to need that later. Okay, now that we have our geometry built, what I want to do is create some spring constraints around it that hold it in place while I have a force push it around as if the wind is pushing it around on the edge of an airplane. So first, I need some points around the geometry in which to start those constraints. So create a grid, and I created just a bound around this object just to have a simple shape, and I Boolean that out so we have a hole. Scale that up a little bit, and then I delete away the front section because I don't want any tape or any constraints from the front. I only want the sides and the back. Scatter those points. Here we go. Now bring in the basic geometry that we created, transform it up just a little bit. That's our starting position. Assemble that, make sure to create packed primitives. This is going to be our out RBD object. Let's object merge these scattered points just from right here. Right here. You could also just drop node, connect the nodes if you want. And what we did here is I created this attribute wrangle with this pretty simple vex right here, which I will copy into the description below. And what this is doing is creating a line between these two geometries, one of these points and the point from the center of the assembled geometry. And that works pretty well, but I want it for each point. So I just simply drop a for each point right here. Drop that down, put it in it, and I'm just going to use what I already have. And you can see, boom, now it's all the points. And that's exactly what I want. So I just simply convert these to polygons. And then I drop an attribute create to make these constraints. So I'm going to need two different attributes, a constraint type. Both of these are primitive strings. Constraint type to all and constraint name to spring. You can see here that we have both of those in our geometry spreadsheet. And that's our out constraint. So before we dive into the .NET, I also wanted this to slide around and rotate in space, not just stick to the ground and slide. So I created this simple geometry, a little tube to put under it, transformed it off the center just a touch, and imported that in as a static object. So let's dive into the .NET. So now in the .NET, you can see the geometry is coming in. We have a ground plane. That little holder is coming in, and we have our spring constraints. So first, you're going to want an RBD packed object. You're going to bring in that out RBD node that we created. And a few changes I made is I turned off compute mass and set mass to 1. And I changed the geometry representation from concave hole to box. I also decreased the collision padding to 0.01. In the rigid body solver, I just changed the sleeping time down to 0 because I don't want this falling asleep. I want it to be active the whole time. I also brought in a pop wind with a velocity of -10 in the x, which is this direction here, and that's the direction I want the wind blowing. And I increased the amplitude to 5. I want this pretty turbulent. We brought in that holder as a static object, and we also dropped a ground plane. I decreased the friction a little bit. Now I brought in that constraint network with that node containing the constraints, and I dropped a spring constraint with the data name spring, which we set. The strength is set to 200. Drop the gravity node, and this is how it looks. Wind is blowing this way, and we have a turbulent amplitude just pushing it around randomly. You can see the spring constraints are generally holding it in place, but it's sliding, pivoting on that point, rotating a little bit. This is exactly what I want. So now back out here at geometry level, use dop import using that node, and then RBD packed object 1 was the name. And I just create points to represent object because I'm going to use the transform pieces. All right, we object merge the detailed pump back in, transform it up just to match the starting position that we set up here, assemble it, and in this case we just used the default name piece, but you can see here this is actually coming in as piece 44, which this is piece 0. These need to match. So I drop a wrangle and just tell it at name equals piece 0. Just straight set it because there's only one. That keeps it really simple. And now we use a transform pieces with the original geometry going in right here and the template points going here. And now you can see that geometry moves the same as the simulation. And that's going to be our out pump sim details. I'm going to do the same thing over here, but with the RBD that we sent directly to the sim. So in this case, we don't need to pack it. We don't need to change its name. That is already set, and we just need to transform pieces, and there we go. So that is our out pump motion. So what I like to do here is copy this node, and I like to create a render node that I use over here. So render pump right here. I would copy it, drop an object merge, and paste it right there. For the duct tape, I actually went with a pretty simple approach. I just have points pinned to this geometry and pinned to the ground, and have the Vellum solver just interact, pushing it around as this slides around. I'll show you how I set that up. So first, I just used a simple grid to create this strip-like geometry, give it some UVs, and I transform it up above this box because I'm just going to have it fall down, collide with it, and collide with the ground. And where it collides, it's going to stick to. So I just created this one, and then another transform node, created another one, moved it around, another one, moved it around, created a handful of them, merge them all back together, and there we go. So all these are going to fall straight down, colliding with this box, colliding with the ground, colliding with each other, and they're going to stick. The trick here is to make sure none of these are intersecting with each other beforehand, and they're not intersecting with the box or the ground beforehand. A remesh node, Vellum just works better with triangles like this than they do with grid geometry. And the more triangles you have, the higher resolution the sim. Generally, the better it looks, but within reason. So now we drop a Vellum constraint node, and this is pretty basic. I just set it to cloth. I set it to a uniform weight of 1, and I set a uniform thickness of 0.001. This is actually important. If you visualize the thickness here, go to the side, you can see these little dots. That's how thick the Vellum solver is going to interact with other geometry. And since we have direct interaction with this box and with the ground, we want this to be pretty small. You can see if I set it back to the default, it's way too thick. So these are going to be hovering off this box, hovering off the ground. That's not what we want. So just drop that down to a much smaller number, and that should look better. Now we need 2 nodes. The geometry comes out of this one. I just named that tape geo, and the constraints come out of this one, named it tape constraint const. Before we go into the .NET, we also need to bring in that pump geometry. So we're going to use the basic one to keep things moving fast. And what I did here is actually dropped a time shift. I just have $f minus 30. So for the first 30 frames of the sim, this box doesn't move. And then after it hits 30, it starts reading the sim data and moves around. The reason I did that is because I want this tape to fall and interact with this box in its static position. So it falls, oops, there we go. It'll fall here for 30 frames, collide, and then settle a bit, and then this will start moving and the tape will interact with it. So we got that time shift, we unpack it, and we create a collision source node, set the voxel size down to 0.1. That looks like this. That should be good enough. And this has 2 nodes coming out, geometry here, volume here, SDF volume coming out this way. And I also created a simple ground plane, dropped a grid, extruded it down, another collision source. This one I set to 0.02. So in the .NET, we have a Vellum solver. I'm going to take you through these nodes. So we drop a Vellum solver. We need a Vellum object with that, but we're not going to use any initial geometry. We're going to bring in our geometry as a Vellum source. And here is where I brought in that tape geo and that tape constraint. Sop path, constraint sop path. And we only want to bring them in once, so leave that at only once. So there, you can see they're coming in above the geometry. What we want to do is drop a Vellum constraint, set it to create constraint each frame, and constraint type attached to geometry. And now target geometry, the target path, we want that box collision geo that we set up out here. Box collision geo right there. And max distance, I found 0.02 worked pretty well. The stiffness is very high, and I do have a breaking threshold that can come into effect, but only very high forces will do it. So it can stick and unstick a little bit. And now we do another one of these, basically the same, each frame attached to geometry, but this time we're colliding with the ground, that same ground collision geo that we made, same distance, same stretch stiffness, but this time no breaking. I want it to just be solid on the ground. We pipe these into the third input of the Vellum solver. We have a pop wind. I also have this set to not start until after frame 30. Same as for the Vellum tape itself falling. I want it to fall, stick, settle, and then have forces act upon it. We have a -5 in the x velocity, pushing it in this direction. Same as the wind on the pump itself. And amplitude of 5, just some random noise pushing it around. We brought in our static objects, the ground collision, and the box collision. I'm using collision detection as use volume collision and volume sample as the mode. And this is where I bring in that SDF that we created right here. Merge those in. On any solver, when you bring in static objects, you need to either make sure that your objects are on the left input here, because left input affects right input. That's the default. So either make sure that's in the left, or you can change this to mutual. Either one works, but just watch out for that. Drop a simple gravity. It falls, finds its position. It does bounce and wobble a little bit, but then at frame 30, boom, the forces kick in. It gets pushed back. These stretch. These are blowing in the wind. Pretty cool stuff. Very simple to set up. To get that, I do a dop import, the dop node .net2, that Vellum object. I blast away, because it imports with that static geometry. I just drop a simple blast node to remove those. And drop a Vellum IO, like so. And this inputs geometry, constraints, and collisions. We're not worried about the collisions. So we bring in the geometry, pipe it into the geometry, bring in the constraints, as so, constraint geometry, pipe that into the second input, and save it out. I also dropped the Vellum post process. You can see here, it gets real crinkly. Just use a simple spatial blur just to smooth that out a little bit. Yeah, that looks better. And there we go. That's our out duct tape. So just like for the out simmed pump, I'm going to take this, copy it, create a render duct tape geometry node, and object merge it in right there. We'll cover all this other stuff later. So back to this. Now that we have our duct tape, we have our simmed pump. Now it's time for the inflatable tube man. So let's start with building him. I'm going to just use a simple tube. Give it some UVs. And now I'm going to create another tube, a smaller one. This is for the arm. Give it some UVs. Transform it into place, like so. I'm going to mirror it across to the other side. Merge those two together and drop a Boolean. So there we go. These are combined together. And I'm going to blast the bottom. I want this open. Now I'm going to do a remesh, but first I want to create a hard edge group around these arms and around the top. So I create a group, set it to edges, set it to include by edge, and then adjust this minimum edge angle until we just have these edge loops here. You can see as I dial this up and down, we eventually get what we want. Name that hard edge. Now we drop a remesh, and we use a hard edge group named hard edge to keep this geometry nice and sharp around these edges. Now I drop a smooth just to get everything smooth and rounded. That's looking good. And I create a group with these bottom points just using a bounding box. And these are going to be the points that are constrained to the pump itself. They're not going to be affected by the simulation, they're going to be affected by the animation. But before we do that, let's also add the hair. So going back up to the top, we have our tube. Blast away the top, so we just have this top geometry. Scale it down just a little bit. And we're just going to take these points around the edge and copy a simple strip on it. That's going to be the hair. But to do that, we're going to need normals. So I can drop a normal. And you can see here, we now have normals pointing straight up. That's not what we want. We want normals pointing out. A simple way to do that, this is a trick I use all the time, is to pack your geometry. What that does is it creates a point right in the middle. And I use an add node to delete geometry but keep points. So now we just have that one point that's directly in the center of this geometry. I create a point VOP. In the point VOP, I use a get attribute to bring in the position of that second input. The second input is that one point we just created. And I subtract that from the position of the first input, which is just our geometry. Doing so, piping that into the normals, gives us normals that point away from that center point. Pretty cool. You can see here, if I were to move this point around, the normals also follow with it. So now we have our grid, and I just copy it to these points. Turn all that off, and there we go. So I template this back, and we can see the hair is now on top of the geometry. This is not quite the orientation I want, so I can just drop a simple transform, rotate it 90 degrees, and there we go. That's what I want. I just simply reverse to get the geometry facing the right direction, drop a remesh, and I create a group called hair with all of this geometry. We'll use that in a minute. So I merge these two together. There we go. Now we have our little guy with his hair. Turn that off for a second. So now we're going to attach it to that pump. So let's bring in the pump. And you can see it's brought in here, but if you recall, we delayed this by 30 frames. So I need that time shift here as well. So now it's delayed 30 frames. There we go. And create an add. I just want the one point. Now I just drop a simple copy to points. And there we go. Now this guy moves with the pump. Pretty neat. You can see here, he's moving with it. But actually, I don't want him this low on the pump. I want him raised up a little bit. So simple transform, move him up. He still moves with it. Perfect. Now we got to create our Vellum constraints. First, we'll start with the body. So I drop a blast node to delete away that hair. That's why we created that group. Makes it nice and easy. Vellum constraint, cloth, uniform mass. This part's important. Pin to animation. We use that bottom group, these points that are down here. We pin that to animation. We click match animation. So those points will move with this animation. Stiffness is set to 500 by 100. And I also gave it a little bit of Vellum pressure up here. Set it to pressure. Just a little bit, just 10. And this just helps it keep its inflated shape a little better. Now let's go back, do the hair. So that same blast node, just set it to delete non-selected. So we just have the hair remaining. Vellum constraint. Cloth, pretty simple. I think it's all the same as this one, actually. Yeah, it's all the same without a pin to animation. What we're going to do with this one is actually glue it to the body. So we need two merges. We need to merge the geometry of both down here and merge the constraints of both down here. Pipe these into a Vellum glue. And now you can see it's taking the two different geometries and creating constraints between them. This you just need to dial up or down these values until you get just the constraints between the two geometries. If you go too much, you'll see that it starts creating constraints between the hair geometry. We don't want that. We want these to all move independently and just be glued to the body. So, like this. Now this one, I just used a basic Vellum solver SOP node. Just like that. We didn't have to create a .NET for this one. Pipe in the constraints here, or the geometry here, the constraints here. I increased the timescale to 2 so that everything moves a little faster, and substeps up to 4. If we dive into the Vellum solver, this takes you to the forces within the .NET. I have a couple things going on here. First and most important, I have a pop fan that is down below the geometry, pointing up. I have it slightly off center because this guy shifts back a little bit with the geometry. But I have some values here. I found a 20 cone angle to work pretty well with a wind speed of 10. And the direction is, of course, pointing straight up. Then I have a large pop wind, just amplitude of 10, swirl size 2. This is a general force pushing it everywhere. And then I also have this a pop advect by volumes. This is primarily how I got the effect for the airplane, which I'm not doing here. I'm just doing a more generic, wacky, wavy, inflatable arm man in this guy, in this tutorial. But I created this pop advect by volumes wind force, which I will show you now. Out here, here's my wind force. In the airplane example, I had a strong directional wind. Oh, it's actually -1. Pushing him this way. So you can see the force here. That's how I did it for the airplane example. In this one, I don't want a strong direction. I just want him flailing around. So I removed the direction. I created this by starting with a box that's going to be big enough to contain the geometry. I create a volume out of that. Up the samples to 100. Create a volume VOP. And here we create a turbulent noise. Change some values here. Make sure it's a 3D noise. I create a parameter called wind, and I add that to this turbulent noise. And then down here, I take the bounding box, vector to floats, because I just want the height, the y. Create a ramp for that. And then I multiply those two together and output that as a vector velocity. Also, this parameter is a vector. So now out here, we have this ramp, which is the height, and we have this wind. I also promoted the offset. Do that by middle mouse clicking, promote parameter. And then it shows up out here. So what I did here, first, I created a simple grid in the middle, use a volume trail using the velocity and changing some of these settings to visualize that force. So we have this. This ramp is the height. So you can see the forces are stronger up here than they are down here. If I were to change that, you would see as such. But that's fine as it is. The wind, this is the direction, which I already showed you. Right now I have no direction, but it can be going up. It can be going forward, backwards, in Z, doesn't matter. In this case, I don't want any direction. And by default, this isn't animated, so I added an offset, just pulling in the frame number, so that way the noise offsets as we move forward in time. So here's what the volume looks like, and that's what we want. Just name that out wind, and copy that node. Come back to our inflatable guy. In the Vellum solver, we use a pop advect by volume with that out wind. I currently have it set to a scale of 10. Have this set to a scale of 10. These forces are all going to vary. You're going to just have to play with these, find something that works for you. I already have this guy cached out using that Vellum IO. And here we go. Pretty cool. You can see he's moving with the pump. He's flailing about, doing his little dance. Pretty neat. I used to post-process again, just a little bit of spatial blur. Not as much this time, just to kind of clean up those crinkles, just a tiny bit. And that's out Inflatable Tube Man. There we go. So once again, I'm going to copy this node, create a render node, and paste it there. Oh, well, not that. Well, it's already pasted there. So now that I have my 3 render nodes, I can visualize these, and that's pretty much done. And there he is. Oh, you can see here that he is not interacting with that pump quite right. And the reason for that is because this pump was offset in time. Or he was offset in time with the pump, but this pump was not. So in the render pump, we just need that time shift here as well. Same value. And there we go. Now he's moving with it. For the duct tape, I also made a couple little changes. First, I wanted, you can see it's interacting pretty well, but I wanted just a little bit more sharpness around those edges. So I merged in the geometry. Whoa. That was weird. So I merged in the geometry and got a simple wrangle here. What I'm doing here is I'm basically finding the distance between these 2 different geometries and pushing this one closer to that one by using these values here. And then I went through and just deleted. I didn't want this tape that's under the vent. That doesn't make much sense. So deleted some of that. Just went through and just kind of made stylistic choices here just to delete away certain parts of the tape. And in my original scene, we only saw it from this angle here, from this camera. So the stuff on the other side didn't really matter. But if you wanted to, you could, of course, clean all this up all the way around. So there you go. That's how the Inflatable Tube Man was made. So now that we have that all together, let's go ahead and just run a quick flipbook. We'll go from the camera. We'll give this a minute to preview. All right, and we're back. Not quite finished previewing, but you get the idea from here. He's looking pretty good. He's waving around. He's dancing. And that pretty much is how that was made. For the airplane example that I made, I just increased that wind force, made it more directional. Adjusted those values just a little bit, but same general concept. If you made it this far, I appreciate you sticking around. Hopefully you learned a thing or two. Again, my name is Kyle Schlosser. If you would like to see any additional tutorials or maybe a follow-up to this on how I did compositing or lighting, anything like that, feel free to let me know in the comments below. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.